Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. Barry LaBov, thank you so much for being our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. I cannot thank you enough. You are one of the most highly accomplished guests we've had on our show, and I'm incredibly honored to be on with you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I love your show. And I love the name, the Mike Litton Experience, because it reminds me of my music days of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. So
I think
it's a great idea.
Oh, I love it. We're going to have to break out the electric guitars. I don't know how to play, but I love his guitar. Oh, Jimi Hendrix is just the man.
Oh, yeah.
He's the man. I just love that. Okay. So like we talked about before we hit record, everybody has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. So with your permission, we'll start with where you were born, go all the way up to today, and then we can talk about anything you'd like to talk about. I'd love to talk about your book that's coming out about differentiation and anything else that you're working on. And knowing you're probably working on 17 different things at once. So is it okay if we just start with where you were born?
I'd love it. Yeah, I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Ooh. And I have been a Philadelphia Phillies and Eagles and 76ers sports fan since I was a little kid.
Oh.
When I was, so I was born in the mid 1950s. My parents were middle-class folks. My dad was an engineer. My mom was a stay-home mom and then was a bookkeeper. Super hardworking people. So I grew up in an environment where you got to work hard, you got to go, work hard, be a good boy, all that kind of stuff. As I was being brought up, my dad at first wanted me, and that sounds a little weird, but he wanted me to be a genius. So he worked on me being a genius. So he taught me algebra when I was 3 years old. So I was a little 3-year-old kid, figuring out algebra equations and stuff like that. And
I love it.
I have to tell you, it sounds bizarre and it sounds like I'm bragging. I'm not bragging at all on it. I loved it.
Yeah.
It was fun.
Yeah.
For some reason, it was fun to do algebra because you could kind of figure out if you were right or wrong, to the point where I really got into that. And I was in 6th grade one day and my teacher said, "Hey, what's 2 + 2? Barry?" And I said, "Well, it depends what X is." And she said, "Well, what do you mean? What about X?" And I said, "X is the unknown."
Right.
And she said, "Who's been teaching you algebra?" My response was, "Well, my dad is." And she said, "You're kicked out of this school until your parents understand they can't do this to you anymore."
Wow.
And I thought that was interesting. So I was kicked out of school because I was doing algebra, which sounds funny.
Goodness.
Yeah, but it was interesting because it was a great lesson. It showed me that, number one, I was able to understand it.
Yeah.
The rest of my school years, math and algebra were easy as could be. Oh, sure. And I loved it. So I grew up kind of thinking about those things. I then realized that I really love sports, but I never was very good at sports. And so I really loved baseball. That was my first love as a kid. So at a certain point, I realized I wasn't very good at baseball, and they found out that I had a lazy eye, the lazy eye you have. So they gave me an operation. And what's interesting is I never understood this until I was 50 years old. But when they do that operation, you lose most of your depth perception. I didn't know that.
Wow. So
for the rest of my life after that, I was a really terrible baseball player. I couldn't hit the ball.
Yeah.
Well, because I had no depth perception.
Right.
And in
That's
golf,
really hard.
It really is. And in golf, it was kind of frustrating too, because putting, I had to figure out how to putt without having depth perception. But anyway, as I was growing up, I got into music very heavily as a young person, and music and math are very connected. So I didn't realize that, but they were. And I started out in clarinet, and I thought that was a boring instrument. I wanted to do rock music because of the Beatles.
Right.
So I learned how to play drums, but I thought that was, it wasn't melodic enough. I wanted to create, Mike. I wanted to do something creative.
Yeah.
So I got into a band with my younger brother. He played guitar. I played drums, but drums and guitar, it's kind of ugly sounding, and I said, well, we need an organ. So my dad bought me a cheap little organ, and I played drums and organ at the same time, which is bizarre.
Wow.
And I sang. So I was singing, writing songs, playing drums, and playing the organ with my right hand in the band. It did not sound great. I can tell you, I've heard recordings of it.
I can't even imagine. I mean, how many hands do you have, right?
Yeah, I was really trying to do something creative. And so as I went on and I was just in my teens at that point, and then started to pursue a music career. And that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I was writing songs. I was in bands. I was the young guy in bands. So I'd be 15, 16, and I became the leader of bands. And these guys, Mike, they were old. I mean, they were 18, 19 years old. And they're taking orders from this 15-year-old kid.
Crazy.
And so I learned how to do recording. I wrote songs and kept pursuing this. And then met a girl in college who I married, my wife, Carol. And she supported me. And I said, I really want to do music. I want to write songs. And she started writing lyrics with me.
Wow.
And for our honeymoon, I said, I'd really like to go to New York City and try to, get our songs published. And she said, that's okay. Let's do it. I said, for our honeymoon? She said, yeah. So on our honeymoon, we went to New York and we pounded the pavements. And I'll tell the listeners, when I say pounded the pavements, we would have 40 appointments in a week. They were generally a half an hour, and we would be literally running from one part of Manhattan to another for the entire week on an hourly basis, trying to get songs published.
Wow.
And I'll tell your listeners, here's a story that I think is really inspiring. Because you always think you got to get people to agree that what you're doing is great. And if somebody says you're doing something and it's not good, you feel terrible. So one of the real hallmark moments of my life was we were getting ready to go to New York again to try to get our songs published, by some of these famous people. And a person said, hey, I know the publisher who worked with the Beatles.
Wow.
And I can get you an appointment with him. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. So I set up my 40-ish appointments, and his appointment was the very first day on a Monday.
Yeah.
So my wife and I got in that weekend, got ready for it, got up early. It was raining in New York City, which is not good. People are in a bad mood. We got in a taxi and we were driven to his office, because we had to get in a taxi because his office was in a really, really remote part of New York City. And we got out, and the building looked dilapidated. It looked like it was almost bombed in the war. I mean, it looked really bad, beaten up. And so we go in, walk up the steps because the elevator didn't work there.
Yeah.
And his name was George Pincus. And I could smell the stench of a cigar as we're walking up, knocked on the door, and a woman came to the door. She kind of looked like a nurse. She was all dressed in white. And I said, I'm here to see George. And she said, okay. And I had been so excited. My wife and I had worked on these songs, and I had begged my friends to play for free on these songs because, we're going to get these songs published, and George Pincus and all this.
Right.
And so out comes this man, and he was probably in his 60s or 70s, tiny little guy smoking a cigar. And he said, okay, give me your tape. So it was a cassette tape. That's how long ago this was.
Yeah.
And many of your listeners won't even know what a cassette tape is, but it was just something. But he took it and he pressed play. And within 10 seconds before the singing would begin, he fast forwarded to the next song. And I thought, oh my gosh. And then the next song started, and my hopes were high. And within 10 seconds, he fast forwarded to the next song. I thought, oh my gosh, this is terrible.
Wow.
Next song did the same thing. Listen to the fourth song, listen to like 20 seconds, stopped the tape, popped it out, handed it to me. He said, kid, you have no talent. I said, what? He goes, you have no talent. He said, give it up. You're never going to make it. You have no creativity.
Oh.
And I was crushed.
Yeah, yeah.
And I literally, they didn't have to open the door, Mike. I could have walked under the door. I felt so small.
Yeah, let me slither out.
Right. It was horrible.
Oh.
And I remember as I'm walking down the steps and my wife's right next to me, and I'm thinking, okay, how fast can I move or fly back to Indiana where we lived? How fast can we just leave right now? Because obviously I have no talent.
Right.
And so I'm standing out, we're looking for a taxi. And I said to my wife, I said, well, we got to leave. We got to go back home. And my wife looked to me and she said, why? I said, well, George Pincus says I have no talent, honey.
Right.
I'm washed up. I'm useless.
Right.
And she said, oh, come on, silly. He's just one person. Who cares? I said, well, I had 40 other appointments. I said, we got to cancel these. She said, no, let's go to them. And number one, I realized how lucky I was to have her as my wife.
No kidding.
And I thought, okay, now this is something that for your listeners, I have, and this is exactly the truth. This is not even abridged or tweaked to make the story sound good. We then got in the cab and we were dropped off in Manhattan at Billy Joel's publishing company.
Wow.
And we had an appointment there. And I walked in, I was still depressed from being told I have no talent.
Right.
And the guy welcomed me in and he listened to the songs all the way through without fast forwarding.
Wow.
And I then got up and I said, thank you, thanks for the time. And he said, wait a minute, what are you doing? I said, well, I appreciate you listening to my music. And the guy says, why are you like this? He said, I think there's some really good songs in here. Ooh. I said, really? He said, well, who have you been talking to? I said, well, I talked to George Pincus. And he said, I have no talent. And he said, he says that to everybody, Barry. Why are you listening to a guy like him? And I said, well, he published the Beatles. And he said, no, he didn't publish the Beatles. He stole a couple of their songs and he got in trouble for it. I went, oh. And I said, okay. And he said, I want to publish one of your songs.
I love it.
Now, here's the reality for everyone. The first person told me I had no talent. Second person published the song. The next 38, 39 of them were nice appointments, but I got nothing for it.
Yeah.
So I learned that, you know what? I have to believe in myself. And it's a numbers game sometimes, but you don't give up.
Yeah. And there are times you're going to get crushed, right? That feeling from when George Pincus said that had to have been just crushing to you. And yet you walk outside, you're ready to cancel everything, go home, right? Because obviously it's your career's over. And your wife is like, no, he's one person. We're not gonna quit based on one person, right? The very next one, had you quit, that would have never been published. The very next one publishes a song of yours. I mean, that is such an amazing story. I love that.
And it's inspiring because it's like, hey, you do your best, you meet with people, and sometimes it's not going to work. Yeah. Well, so what?
Yeah.
Move on.
Yeah.
You know what? It's okay. So what happened was I carried on in my music business. I ran a jingle company, those irritating little ditties. And I did hundreds and hundreds of jingles. And as I went through that, I also started a rock band that was on American Bandstand.
Ooh.
and had music on VH1 and some other rock video networks. And then at a certain point, I decided I wanted to move into a different field that was creative, which was more marketing and all. And it was because I was doing these jingles and things like that. And a client called me and said, hey, I want to talk to you about taking over our marketing department. I want to sell our marketing department. And it was North American Van Lines, which was interesting.
Yeah.
And I said, and being a great entrepreneur, I said, no, I don't do that. I'm not, I just do jingles and other stuff. For 1 year, they asked me.
Really?
And one day they called me up and they said, will you take over our department? We'll sell it to you and we'll give you a 5-year contract to do all our work. And I said, I've given you my answer, which was no. I've also given you other companies to talk to. Why do you keep coming back to me?
Right.
And I'll always remember this. He said, because we trust you.
Yeah.
And it hit me, Mike, like a ton of bricks. And I said, okay, I'll do it. Yeah. And he said, okay. He said, you're now going to be in the marketing business. You're going to have an agency because we're handing this to you.
Right.
And from that point on, which has been 40 years ago. Yeah, 30 years ago. I've been running a marketing business. And because they believed in me.
Yeah.
And so what I have done after that is I've looked at how do I stand out in a crowded field where there are over 2 million marketing and advertising agencies in the world. And how do I stand out? How do I differentiate?
Right.
What can I do? And in that time, I've built out of Fort Wayne, Indiana and Dallas, Texas, a company that works with some of the greatest brands in the world, which include Macallan Scotch. It includes Audi and Mercedes. So there's drinking and driving, but not at the same time.
Right.
But we do Macallan Scotch, Stoli, vodka, Macallan. No, I mentioned them: Audi, Mercedes, Volkswagen. Many great companies that we've been able to work with. Yeah. Harley Davidson as an example. So to this day, my company is very successful in those areas, and our clients turn to us. On a personal side, I have 2 children with my wife. One's 26. He's my boy. My daughter's 30. My son works with me at my company. Oh, that's awesome. And my daughter has 2 kids that are my grandkids, and I'm enjoying every single day.
That's awesome. So my kids are 25 and 23. My daughter came to work with me a couple of months ago. She had been working with me for about an hour and a half, went to her mother and said, I feel like the top of my head's going to blow off. Dad's a lot, Mom. Dad's a lot. Right? We just celebrated our 30-year wedding anniversary, and my wife's like, yes, honey, I know.
Well, I like to say my wife and I have been married since 1978. And we've had 22 years of happy marriage.
Now, see, somebody who's been married as long as we have gets that joke.
Right. Now, my wife never likes that. She always points to her ring and she says, 40 years of service or something. So. But I think it's all about, you got to enjoy what you do, and you've got to feel you're making a difference and that what you do actually has significance. Yeah. Right. Otherwise, who cares?
Yeah. We did an interview yesterday with a gentleman, and we were talking about people living their calling. And that's, this is an example, right? North American just would not give up having you take over their marketing. They just weren't going to do it because they trusted you.
Right.
That's what's most important, right? It's you do the right thing, you work hard, you do what you've been designed to do, and everything falls into place. You go where people value you, right? Like we were talking about it yesterday. This podcast that we're doing, that we're on right now, is absolutely, I feel like, my calling. I feel like I've been prepared my entire life for this. And I'm now fulfilling that mission. I'm now, I'm getting the word out, right? And I'm helping people to promote the amazing things that they're doing. And it's such an amazing honor. And I cannot thank you enough for doing this. So, okay, so let's talk about, you have 10 books that you've written, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And some of them were children's books.
Mm-hmm. They look like children's books. They're parables.
Yeah.
Meaning they're business parables. They're short stories. And then the current book that I have that is currently being published, it's not released yet, by Simon and Schuster, is definitely not a children's book. It's a business book on differentiating yourself, your brand, your products. And one thing to share that's interesting is my company for decades has worked with some really great companies, as I mentioned. And what's interesting is in the last 15 or so years, the world's changed. So Mike, to share with you, 15 years ago, I would be sitting down with the leader of a major company, and I would say, look, we can help identify or discover what makes your product or brand unique.
Right.
And he or she would say, great, we need that because we want to increase our market share. We want to increase profit. I go, great. And I would add, but the other benefit is that you will be able to share that with the people who build your products, service your products, sell your product, the people who work for you. Mm-hmm. And that is amazing. And 15 years ago, most of the CEOs or leaders would say, I don't care about that. I'm already paying them $15 an hour, $10 an hour, whatever they pay. Today, it's different.
Yeah, completely.
When that CEO talks to us and we say, look, we can help you with that and we'll help you with market share. And, he or she's nodding their head. And I go, and what we do is we make sure the very first people who learn what makes you different and unique is your employees. It's going to be the people who serve and represent your brand. These CEOs literally tear up because that's even more important. And I think that's a sign of the times, but it's a good thing.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. I mean, there are some things that are happening today that weren't happening 15 years ago, right? There's a lot. Right. The thing is, there's a huge amount of competition that these companies have for workers. And there's also a big push for retention, right? Because the more you can go get, the more successful you are at getting them and then retaining them, the better your company is, period, right? And so nowadays, that kind of thing is so much more important than it used to be. Back then, it was, I'm paying them a wage, right? I'm paying them to do what they do. I don't care anything about that. I'm looking for the consumer. Today, you're selling everybody. You're selling everybody, including, and most importantly, the people that currently work in your organization. Yeah, I totally
agree. Right. You're right. During COVID, I believe it was 40 million people quit their jobs during COVID. Yeah. Okay, so 40 million people said, okay, I'm out of here. And if you think about it, if you're a person running a company, which many of your listeners are, it's like, oh my God, because you not only have to make sure you compete well with other brands, you got to compete well with other ways to stay, and you want to bring good people in. Yeah. And it's not enough to say, hey, here's your so much an hour.
Right.
Put your head down and get the work. It doesn't work. It's not the way it is anymore.
Yeah, I ran 2 corporations for over 18 years. And I had a bunch of people working with me. And it was a constant grind. And the constant grind was everybody and their brother were trying to come and get our people. Right. Yes. They were trying to lure them away. And it was always, money, and it was this and it was that. But they were always trying to lure them away. And what was interesting, I found later, was we had a better retention number in terms of how many people we retained that we did not lose than just about anybody else in our space. And it was because we had a culture where we appreciated the people that worked for us. We cherished them, right? And I would be one of those CEOs tearing up, because that's how important my people were to me and are to me today. I mean, we haven't been in business since 2018, right? And a bunch of those people are coming back to me and going, Mike, you got to open up a company again. You got to do this again. And I'm not going to, but they're asking me to,
Right.
And it's just an absolute honor for them to do that, We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out calendly.com/Rio760.